filter end. Okay, well, regular attendance this week. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the KIND sub-project meeting. This is Monday, March 11th, 19. Just a quick reminder that this meeting follows the CNCF Code of Conduct, which basically filters down to don't be a jerk. And this meeting will be recorded and posted publicly. So it looks like first up we have Antonio's discussion of CNI. You want to take away with that?
Yeah. Hi, this is Antonio. I was working on the IPv6 support, and I was finding that struggling with the different plugins, and I just created some simple plugin that allows to test with IPv6. I wanted to ask, when are you going to merge the V1 Alpha 3?
I have like one last change that needs to happen for handling implicit load balancers, and then I'm gonna click submit on that. I was halfway through this when the call started.
Oh well, I wanted to know if it's 1 week or 1 month or 1 day.
It'll be today.
Well, but then with the I don't know the name, the one person suggested to use to mount the folder. So with that, we can use different CNIs, so that problem is solved. And if you add the networking field, we can parse the IP address and detect if it's IPv6 or not. So I think that with that, I can submit a pull request to have IPv6 support.
Okay, I had a quick question about that. So what was the problem with Calico exactly?
I tried it quickly and I wasn't able to make it work at the first time. So okay. I used the time to study a bit more CNI. It was a long time since I was in contact with Kubernetes anymore. And the next time, once I have this working, I will try to set up Calico. But I want first to have something working with IPv6 and then start to add the other CNIs. Because if I do the opposite, I start to test the CNIs and I cannot make it work.
Right. Yeah, I just wasn't sure if we needed to be shipping something like your KindNet, or if we can, if we might be able to get away with one of the standard ones, just so it's not another thing that we own.
I suggest to go with the standards, but first I want to have something stable testing IPv6 to know, if the problem is in Kubernetes, the problem is in the CNI, the problem is in Kind. This way we can identify what is the problem. I set up an environment in Circle CI, so I will let you know. Once I have something working, I will try Calico and I will let you know.
Okay, great, thank you. So Timothy has, when is the next planning cycle / 115 plans? So I think we've gotten a bit out of sync with Kubernetes, and that's probably okay. We're trending towards like monthly-ish releases. I'm hoping that we'll be ready this week. Mostly wanted to land the new configuration version so we can go ahead and roll that out. That one makes it a bit easier for us to start extending some other things. That should happen today, and we figured later this week. So the next release will be next month, after this week. I would have said today, but there's some people that I would really like to have involved, like Lubomir. that don't appear to be here today. So I might say maybe the next meeting and we send a heads up.
So yeah, I want to do the announcement because all the Europeans are on weird time frame difference for this week. But
right.
We have some things we want to accomplish for 115.
Mhm.
I think we can break it down to a reasonable set of things to deliver in kind that doesn't disturb or rock the boat too much. I think,
Mhm.
but I want to make sure that the time frames for things overlap, because currently your 1.0 release says March 31st.
That's almost definitely not going to happen.
So I don't exactly know when the time frames are, because like I'm looking from the outside in, so trying
Right.
to.
Yeah, I think that would have been nice, but we'll probably need to, slow up and push that back and let alpha and beta take their natural course. It was a good forcing function for trying to think about how to get some of these things to stable, but I think it's a bit optimistic to say, oh, it's 1.0 now that quickly. So we will also just need to have a discussion about when that should be.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to enable support so we don't carry these weird patches is phases.
Mm-hmm.
If we have phases support, then I think we can get rid of the other fork that Fabrizio is currently holding.
I actually think we can have that really soon, and even a more powerful one that includes a phase for just the node creation explicitly. I did a pretty big refactor of what's essentially the internal phases, and there's like one more step. I'm going to make it fully reentrant as well, so that you can actually arbitrarily stop at any given phase and then run the other phases.
That'd be perfect.
That should be pretty easy to add now. We basically just need to plumb through some command line option.
I think that'll give a nice exit strategy too for the upgrade scenario, where if you don't want to plumb through upgrade, which is totally fine, if we have individual phase support, then they could stop and do the customization for upgrades, and we could even build that into CI via script or whatever if we wanted to.
Right. Yeah, I've been thinking about that one a lot. That one definitely seems like a big blocker for, like, I want to hack on Cubatum and I want to test this. You need to be able to like bring up the nodes, change something, run the actual init.
Well, we want to get rid of like the test jig, right? Like that's the biggest thing is like we want to get rid of some of the test jigs that exist inside of Proud today, and that's one of the blocking things we need is a Kubernetes upgrade to get rid of that goop.
That's and then that actually leads pretty nicely into one of the other things that we need to fix up right now. There is like a config file for all of the nodes, Kubernetes wise, and that's going to make it a little difficult to properly do like multi-version clusters. And I think during one of the phases cleanup, there's a way we can fix that, and that's also something that we should really land, so that you can have. Right now, technically, it's possible to set them to different images with different versions, but there's not really any support beyond it. We'll use that image. It's not smart about it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think phases is a meaningful step that gets everybody to a happy path. So,
were there any other big blockers? We've been talking about that one for a while, and I think we can unblock that one like now-ish.
That's the only blocker that I'm aware of, but I'll sync with Fabrizio and Lubomir on Wednesday and let you know.
Okay. Yeah, so I started to do this also and then realized that we should. So everyone, I made a milestone for 0.3 and I adjusted the date for 0.2 that we didn't get to be by the end of this week. And then I just said 0.3 for a month out because that's been about the cadence that we've actually gotten to. It's about a month. But we should really get everyone in, like, discuss.
So what's the consumption model for Kind though? I mean, I understand the desire to get things out more frequently, but like when do consumers consume it?
It should be good right away. I mean, so we're always running against head for the CI. The ideal model I want to get to is where you should be able to just pull the latest binary always, and we don't break you. We've prioritized changing things that we think should be changed breaking wise. Like, for example, we used to prefix the cluster name and we dropped that pretty early The other model is that we've been pretty careful about if you have an image that you want and you're using, you should be able to switch between versions of the binary and it should work. Even if we've like enhanced things, it will gracefully degrade to the old behavior if something isn't present in the image. So like we now pre-include CNI, so it doesn't have to pull that. If it can't find one, it will fall back to the old behavior of just installing Weave from upstream. So I really want to get to a point where we can just regularly push binaries, and if you use the latest one, it should just work. And you should get improvements for like a proxy support that are just straightforward enhancements. Shouldn't be breaking behavior.
Sounds good. So I'll sync with Lubomir and Fabrizio on Wednesday and come back next week.
Cool. So actually that was the other thing. I'm not sure, given our attendance, we could next week, but I think at some point we should also have a discussion about if we should switch to bi-weekly. Last week, like we effectively are bi-weekly now. Last week it was just me and James. So I think early on we had a lot of like momentum trying to get in some of these key features that everyone needed, but now that we've got most of that besides phases, there's not necessarily as much of desire for like meeting very, very regularly. And I looked around and it looks like most of the sub-project meetings are about every other week.
Typically, yeah. I think the one request I would have though is if you meet bi-weekly to make sure that you're still regularly grooming the backlog, because looking at the milestones is not intuitive.
What do you mean by that? Like,
so I'm looking at the milestones, and there's like a 0.3 release, and at April 12th, and the 1.0 release is on March 31st.
Oh, right. The 1.0 release doesn't have a valid date yet because we need to figure out what the date is. The other one should be valid.
Yeah.
And that actually might be a good next point of con. And does anyone have any thoughts on that? As far as when 1.0 should be, or when we think might be likely?
I mean, I think enumerating exactly like what we qualify as necessary for that. That way we kind of start dropping things in if we kind of agree on a release cadence of a month. We can update those 0.2 and 0.3 milestones to reflect it, and then probably set.
Right, that makes sense. I think one of the biggest ones that isn't actually explicitly listed anywhere here is like having the config to at least beta grade. So we're saying like we are actually not going to break that since we're still calling that alpha.
Yeah.
I feel like it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to have 1.0 and the primary way of turning any knobs is marked alpha.
Yeah, I think we should probably change clear the date on the 1.0 milestone, because you can just.
Oh, you can just remove it? Yeah, I'll do that now. That done.
Cool.
That makes sense. Yeah, okay. That makes sense. It would be good to set a real one, but if we can just have it not have one for now, that at least sends a clearer signal. A lot of these look like the things that we have put in the milestone already look like things that are going to fall in pretty quickly, pretty easily. Or some of them are possibly already done and just need updating, like the Windows usage improvements. I imagine it's not actually going to need to be that far out. We just need to get to where we're comfortable with like the knobs configuration.
Yeah, I mean, once we get some conversion tooling in there, I think if we can go through one iteration of changing something, then it'll probably be a lot more confidence that we can.
So one of the things we did before in the past too is in kubeADM land before we got to GA is we made sure that we had broader wide sweeping adoption before we wanted to promote to GA, because what we found is that the signal you get back from the wild is much larger. So if you said, like, if you made some milestone that says, like default CI integration tool for KK, for other CRD integration or migration tools, maybe Travis CI or other standard CI tools, that's the default way for them to actually do their testing. That might be a good way to make sure that you have all the routable signals fed through before you get to GA.
Yeah. For me, other than closing out some of these things like phases, the biggest thing I want to be looking towards, but I don't think is a 1.0 blocker, is better support for serving traffic from a cluster locally, so that you can like test that you have some application and that you can have some integration test run and hit all the endpoints. A lot of people have these test setups that aren't nice like smoothly and they don't run in the clusters, so they want to like talk through like an ingress or a load balancer or something like that. Right now, it's difficult with Kind to connect up things on the host to without using something like kubectl proxy, which hasn't been great so far. So got a couple of ideas with that. James, did you wind up playing with the IP route or the adding the address on the host at all?
I've not had a chance to give it a go. I think it's
I haven't either.
a viable way to do it. One thing I was gonna say, which is slightly on a tangent, but just back to what we were saying before, I found, at least on Cert Manager, when I was managing, because we're also trying to maintain a 1.0 milestone, and because issues and PRs can only be a member, like they can only have one milestone attached.
Right.
I actually created a 1.0 project just so that I can kind of keep track of what does need to land in 1.0 whilst it also tracking where it's actually going to land before that.
That makes sense. So you're primarily using milestones, but you're using a project for 1.0.
Just like for visibility for people, so you can kind of see the overarching thing. We actually go beyond that and create a project per milestone too, and add everything in, but I think that's a separate thing. We've also picked up on SIG cluster lifecycles next milestone, which I found quite useful to sort of be like, right, you know, I know that we do need to do this pretty soon. It kind of overlaps with the priority labels a bit, but that might just be the way we're using it. But it has been quite useful just to have a bit of a place where you can keep a milestone on it, which is like
Yeah, I think the priority labels and the different minor releases probably hit that, but the concept of making sure that you have things marked as like this is for the next one makes sense.
Yeah, I think the reason we do next is because we used to pretend and actually have many milestones, and we used to lie to ourselves every cycle about like trying to get to something in a certain milestone. So instead we just put it into next every single time. and then we go through next every time to actually see like what can we really accomplish this next cycle. Because what we always found that we did was we would overestimate what we could possibly accomplish.
I borrowed some from Test Infra where we have these like 2018 goals, 2019 goals, and then I haven't borrowed yet because we haven't been that far out, but Test Infra also has a someday milestone that's like, yeah, this isn't slated at all. Like we're going to track that this is an idea, but it's no one's taking this on. This isn't happening.
Yeah, that's what we leave those things into the, we don't even like put them in a milestone. We just put the backlog on it because that way any rando can see that like, you know, it would be nice if I had a pony.
Right. Like we're aware pony would be great, but it's not happening.
Yeah,
I don't think we've had any of those open yet. They've mostly fallen into things where it's like, yeah, it would be good to do it this year, ideally, but I could see that happening eventually. Like one that would probably make sense for that is the homebrew formula. That seems like a thing that's like, someday maybe if we ship 1.0, we should do that, but really not important.
Yeah, I think we've used a combination of help wanted and priority backlog to kind of convey, you know, if someone wants to do this, we are all for it. It's a good idea, but like it's just a priority for.
I did go through and do that yesterday as well. I filed some good first issue things and marked some more, and we've already had all of them taken up. So
it's working.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, I'll try and take a look, and maybe I might move some of the 1.0 milestone things into a 1.0 project.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will also be sending you that V1 Alpha 3.1. There's a little bit of hairy API machinery stuff going on with that, with the conversion between 2 and 3. They're not an exact one-to-one. Had to write some manual conversion stuff. I think that it makes sense, but I haven't done a manual conversion before, so I really appreciate a pair of eyes on that.
Cool. Send it over.
I also want to mention, Antonio, the IPv6 stuff is really awesome to see. We haven't been able to prioritize this yet, but Kubernetes not having any CI for this has been a pain point. It's really great to see someone carrying that. I would love to get that in.
Yeah, I was working with LeBlanc he was using what's the name? The kubeadmin, the Docker in Docker, I don't know, one bash script. But this project was easier to implement it. So the goal is to try to add a job in the CI with IPv6. I started to clean some of the tests that were failing, but well, let's see how long it takes to have this test working.
Well, thank you for working on that. It's really great to see that going forward. It's been one of those things that has been somewhere really far down on my stretch goals that I don't think I'm going to get to. It's really nice to see someone tackling that.
You're welcome. So the other question is, what is the thing that you were saying, that the way to interact with what's the name? With this, the integration test with Docker, to expose the services, what's?
Oh, so fun thing. So people have tests where they run an HTTP server app in their cluster, and then they want to talk to it and see it routed to different versions. So when I was looking at Knative, so Knative has scale to 0 and multiple versions, and they have this component that selects to different backends. So they do integration tests against that, and that means that you need to be able to serve traffic from your cluster to something outside the cluster, because that's what they're looking for, is that code path. So with Minikube, there's some pretty terrible hack you can run that someone built just so that you can run these tests, where you add IP routes on the hosts, and then you run a controller that just overwrites the external IP on every service to be the VM IP. The same thing as a node IP. Okay. It's not even really a controller. So we were looking at can we do something like this with Kind? And so one interesting suggestion I got was that we take some private IP space that's not being used by the cluster, and we add, and we have run a controller on the host, and it's monitoring for load balancer services, and whenever it sees one, it can ensure that there is an additional IP address added to an interface on the host on a private IP space. Then it can listen on that address and set up some kind of tunnel to the container network, to the appropriate node. And then in theory, that should mean that from inside the container network, you'll send a request out to the external IP address. Thanks for coming, Tim. So you'll see a request going to this IP address that doesn't exist in the cluster network. So it should bounce out. And then when it gets to the host, it should see that IP address exists on the interface, and then go to the thing you have listening on the load balancer ports, which can be some kind command. And then that can route back into the cluster. And so you can actually have, in theory, a load balancer IP and support load balancer services.
Okay.
Across the container network, and that should even work hopefully on Windows and Mac as well. We'll just need something. The thing that's listening on the host will need to bounce traffic by way of I don't know, maybe a container that it runs an SSH tunnel on or something.
You said that Minikube implemented it, no?
Not exactly. So that what they have Minikube didn't implement this at all. For Knative, someone else implemented this thing where you just go ahead and add a route on your host to the Minikube address, and then you run a controller that just overwrites the external IP on load balancer services to be the node IP. And I'm not sure how well that works, but that's also a little bit of a different problem because it's doing the VM on the VM interface as opposed to like the containers on the container network. So we've already talked for a while now. We should be able to do something like maybe SSH tunnels do to like feed arbitrary numbers of ports into the network. Because the alternative is that we would need to like bind ports to the containers ahead of time, an arbitrary number of them, which is a problem. But if we have some tunnel mechanism, then we can just open up ports on the host whenever we want ports. So then I had a suggestion from Justin SB that lets us take it a step further and say, well, instead of just binding ports on the host, we could also create IP addresses. Because you could just add an IP address to an interface. So we can just add a private IP potentially and bind listening for traffic on that IP. And then that should let you actually create multiple load balancers even on like the same port. Not sure how well it's going to actually work. There may be various problems with that, but it's probably worth exploring.
So let me. I remember a use case similar. Let me think about that. I don't know if it can be related and can help. I will try to play with it during this week.
That'd be great. I'm also planning to play with just like letting you put host ports on a node and just say up front that like, okay, I need to have these ports bound to the host. And then you can like use host networking for your pod, hopefully, and that will go through to the container port that's bound to the host so that you could set up something like Ingress Nginx and serve traffic locally. Because there are a number of these use cases where you want to test an app that are blocked on this kind of thing.
But I think that I tested the Nginx Ingress and worked. I don't know.
So the problem is like you should be able to deploy and it should work. The problem is getting traffic in from the host.
I know how to do it. How I did it is I remember I installed Ingress and I added an DNS entry to the IP of the Docker with Ingress. So all the traffic go to the Ingress and the Ingress is able to reach the.
Mm-hmm. Also also on Mac and Linux Mac and Windows it gets worse because the containers are like in a VM. Yeah. So but we should be able to solve this if we let you bind similar ports probably. There may be some. That's probably mostly a UX issue. The main reason I'm not a fan of that is that's going to get a little bit weird in multi-node situations, like knowing where to put the ingress on the node that actually has the ports fully open to the host. And, you can't run like two clusters with that and like you only get that port once, whereas the hack with the extra IP, if that worked out, you could just spin up load balancers on the fly and have them pick a different IP and like route traffic to them in exactly the way that you would expect.
Well,
it's just quite a bit more complicated.
the more nodes, the more complicated. Okay. Well, thank you for this information.
I imagine that the biggest problems we'll see are be like if you add this interface, if you add this IP and you add it to like one of the actual network interfaces, then suddenly your host machine is like advertising IPs it shouldn't. So we'll want to avoid that probably. And the other thing will be just the mechanism that actually gets the traffic into the cluster is probably going to be awkward. It's probably going to need to be something like an extra container that gets provisioned with a port open for like SSH, and then you can bounce traffic through that into whichever node container you want.
Yeah, but the thing I'm thinking in Docker, I don't know, because Docker imposes some restrictions on the network, And
so if we have a container running that you can talk to on a port, we can like proxy traffic through that container to the nodes, but that may be a little bit awkward to implement.
No, well, if you are only load balancing, the thing is, how do you scale that if you want to have more clusters? You spawn new containers per cluster.
Well, so I think maybe it's probably one container per instance of the load balancer controller running, which will need to be actually on the host because it will need to open a port on the host to listen on the IP address and then route back into the cluster network. But then you can talk to it from inside or outside the cluster on the same address, which is what you would expect for an external IP.
Wow, it's just getting too complicated. I need to draw.
Yeah. It's definitely too complicated, but if we could play with it and if it works, we might be able to design something out over time, and it will let you do a lot of testing that would otherwise be tricky. Like you can have multiple services talking to each other, and it can look a lot like a real environment.
Because the people want to expose this service to the host, and they don't care about the port. I mean, I've exposed an Nginx, and they want to expose it in a specific port, or they want to have it
I'm not sure, but I think the main thing is that you want to, as closely as possible, be able to have like a set of manifests for your app that's like the same thing, but like running in a fake environment, right? Like that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to fake out Kubernetes just on your machine. So we want to give you multiple nodes and like dynamic volume provisioning and everything. And maybe it's not quite as good as a real one, but it at least mimics the rough behaviors of like what you would expect using as much as possible standard tooling.
Okay. So they can use this for developing Helm charts and all this stuff. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So that's the same thing with like, there's a dynamic volume provisioner for making persistent volumes. But what it actually does is it just makes directories. We'll probably want to add that built in soon.
The one from Rancher or Rancher.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So that way you can just take a chart and deploy it and it should just work. So the other one is traffic serving.
Okay. Well, I will think about it. I think that I don't know if Docker has some tools or some tooling that we can use. You know.
It's also that's also a long-term thing. Like some people have suggested things like this, and we haven't, rushed them in because it is easy to get complicated, and complicated is maybe okay,
Yeah.
but we shouldn't rush it. Should like think about it. Try your options before we say this is the way.
Yeah, maybe using a Google Doc for a spec is going to be with some use cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the real thing there is that I'm just stating some intent that like for going into like Kubernetes 1.15, traffic serving is one of the areas that I want to explore better. I've got some people are very interested in using it, but they're running into like they can't run their whole test suite because anywhere that they had traffic serving, it doesn't really work with these so well with most of these local clusters. So they're just like not running those tests where they should be. And I think it's a solvable problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I have to drop. Thank you for the meeting.
Thanks for coming. I know I've also fallen a bit behind on the PR. My goal has just been to like get through stuff like the V1 Alpha 3 redesign, so we could say, okay, this is in a little bit better shape now. Let's start extending it.
Yeah, well, I stopped it because I don't know what changed everything.
I completely rewrote. I almost completely rewrote and reorganized like cluster up. I have a few more things I want to do there. So I was like, I know I need to do this, and I know it's gonna like break all the PRs. So I just kind of pushed that and got behind on some of the existing.
But now it's awesome. You can spawn. I don't know how if you measure the performance improvement, but I can spawn a cluster. The problem is that sometimes one of the workers takes some time in join the cluster. I don't know why. Maybe they have
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. So it basically things are just much more parallel now, whereas they were all entirely serial steps. Anything that was obviously parallelizable is now running concurrently now, and that does mean that occasionally, like maybe one of them gets starved out a little bit or something, because we're just saying, okay, these are all the workers that can join them all now.
Yeah. Well, but that's a good test too, to see to see the
yeah
of the PI.
Well, we did find out we actually really, for control planes joining, you actually can't do this. It's not safe. Like it will break. So.
Well, okay. Well, nice to meet you. Hope to see you next week.
Yep. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
I don't know if he's back yet. So hi, Mike, I say you pop in there. If you have any questions or anything. Not, it might be about time to just go ahead and call it early. I'll let James get back. Yeah. Did you have any questions or anything? Or just observing?
So basically, what I was like, currently I'm working with a cluster, trying to run the conformance test. Basically, the E2 issue and try to see whether they are running or not. But if I have one config file and try to see whether they are working in the kind cluster or not. So most of the time I face the errors. I'm not certain about which exact error I'm facing. So I just wanted to get confirmation, like whether I would be able to utilize those config file and try to see like how the kubectl is behaving on that kind cluster. Is it possible without
It
any issue?
should work. I wrote up how I did the tests when I submitted conformance for 113. I can pull that up. And we also have continuous tests running. I've noticed that if you try to run them in parallel, they're a bit flakier, but serially, it's been pretty reliable. Just the occasional flake, it should work. The only thing being that unless you have the latest ones, you need to make sure that it knows about. Well, so there was a certain version number frame where you needed to tell the test that there were multiple worker nodes, or one of those would fail. And then you need a kind config that actually does do multiple nodes. Here we go. I found the submission for that.
Most of the time I use the master branch itself. First of all, create the base image and the node image, and then out of that the cluster. So and also, like, I'm much more working on promoting existing E2E2 conformance. And before that, I just wanted to get certain guidelines from you, like what kind of the area would be there, which I can focus on, like before promoting it to conformance. Like suppose against the conformance specific version, or seeing whether this feature is good to promote or not. So just
that I'm not actually sure on. I think the conformance work group and SIG architecture kind of get to determine that.
So basically, I'm in continuous communication with the Aaron, and currently the Srinivas Balbrahmamurthy.
Aaron is a very good person to talk to about that. I normally, if there's anything I want to change with the conformance tests, I run it by him.
Okay, sure, definitely. Okay, thanks. So that was the major concern I wanted to get clarity on.
Yeah, thanks. Let me know if you have any specific problems with this, please like file an issue or say post some details in the chat or something. It should work. I'm looking through the dashboards right now, and we didn't have like a flake on master, but and the ones that are using the Sonobui image are, that job setup is not quite right yet, but the other versions like 1.12 have run continuously for about a month without any problems now, running the full conformance suite.
Oh, true. So,
Cool. Well, I think it's about time to call it. It's not quite the end of the slot we have, but it seems like everyone came in and asked their things. So happy Monday, everyone. Thanks for coming.
happy Monday. Bye.